Welcome, my soft-thinking listener. You've found yourself in the company of the Sleepy Sloth once again. A slow, scientifically minded fellow who enjoys facts, shoelaces, and things that lace shoelaces through shoes. I must tell you something before we begin. Today, I consider myself a scientist in shoelace history. A scientist wannabe who is almost always correct, except for those few times when I am not. But even then, I prefer to drift gently onward, rather than fuss over it. Because what truly matters is the information itself. Before I start, please, let me know, what is the most boring thing you would secretly love hearing about? Let me know gently, in the comments. Now, let us begin today's episode of Shoelaces. In the soft, blue hush of alpine air where ice keeps its own slow calendar, the shoes that accompanied the man we call Ötzi cradle attention without asking for it, dated to roughly 3300 BCE and found with his remarkably preserved body. These shoes were an assembly of carefully chosen materials: a bearskin sole, an upper of deerskin, an inner net of lime, linden, mast that held insulating grass, and ties braided from bast or formed from thin leather strips, and the lacing and netting are as clever as they are quietly practical. The maker wove a bast lattice to form an inner shape, filled it with dry grass to trap warm air, then drew the leather upper around the structure and closed the shoe with thongs and braided cords. Nothing showy, only a layered practicality that kept a foot warm in harsh high mountain weather. When a cord frayed, a new length could be cut from a spare piece of hide or a fresh twist of bast. When the net sagged, the inner weave could be retensioned. The whole contrivance was mendable beside the hearth with a small knife and patient hands. Archaeologists and experimental archaeologists have reconstructed the shoe to learn how each component behaves in movement and wet. The result is always the same in its mild perfection: insulation, shape, and irreplaceable fastening. The laces are not mere decoration, they are modest actors in a small engineering problem solved long before anyone called such solutions design. With a feather-soft pause between facts, we can almost feel how the braided bast slides through a slit of tanned hide and holds its knot like a patient promise that each step will keep the foot safe. Across the long, sun-warmed plains and along the banks of the Nile, early Egyptian sandals of about 3000 BCE, some woven of papyrus, some cut from leather, and often fastened with rawhide or leather straps, kept feet cool in a climate that prized airflow as much as protection, and their simple ties served a double life of practicality and modest ornament. In some tombs and depictions, the straps are slim and graceful; in others they are substantial, looped around toes or crossed over the instep and then secured by a narrow thong or knot that the wearer could adjust depending on how far they walked that day or how hot the sand had made their feet swell. The materials were chosen for local abundance: papyrus and woven reed soles where plant matter was close at hand, leather where animals were processed, and rawhide thongs that resisted abrasion on dusty roads. Archaeological work and careful catalogues of finds show that these ties were sometimes merely utilitarian, sometimes worked into the visual grammar of dress, but always repairable: a worn strap replaced easily with a fresh strip, a fraying thong recut and tacked in place. These laces and straps were small, repeatable solutions to a daily problem, keeping a sole aligned under a living, walking foot, and they persisted in one form or another for centuries as artisans refined stitching, punching, and tying into quiet, dependable rituals of dressing and mending. Along the long, slow river valleys of ancient China, the plant called hemp has a patient history of being pulled into service, and by around 2500 BC, centuries before cotton became common in many regions, hemp fibers were twisted, corded, and sewn into the very seams that held footwear together. These cords and stitches, robust and slightly coarse, offered tensile strength and resilience suitable for securing cloth or leather to a sole. Textual and archaeological evidence together show hemp used for ropes, mats, and garments across millennia of Chinese history, and its application in footwear was natural, thread strong enough to stitch, tie, and mend. Where a cord tied a shoe, it was often hemp, flax, or in wealthier circles, silk, Cords were sometimes plied into braids to make them easier to knot and less likely to abrade when pulled repeatedly through slits or small loops. The material choice affects the feel. Hemp grips with a slight tooth under finger and tongue, and its knots hold with a dependable, workmanlike integrity. It can be treated to resist moisture but remains more textured than a later cotton lace. Archaeologists and textile specialists note how hemp threads and cordage turn up in early contexts, and historians reading those remains see long traditions of cord making passed from loom to shoemaker, each quietly teaching the next how best to hold leather to foot, cloth to sole. With a soft, collected breath we notice the way a hemp cord's fiber splays a little when knotted, how that tiny fray becomes a promise that the cord will wear in rather than break suddenly, and how such small behaviors shaped how people tied their shoes for the simple business of walking. In the damp and fertile plains that cradled Mesopotamia, images in surviving objects remind us that leather thongs and straps were the commonplace answer to the problem of securing a sole to a living foot. By around 2000 BCE, depictions on cylinder seals and in art suggest sandals and simple footwear where leather strips passed beneath and across the foot, sometimes anchored by a cap at the heel, sometimes threaded through slits cut into the sole itself. The materials used, tanned hide, simple stitched uppers, and narrow thongs, were practical for walking among irrigated fields and clay-walled towns. A thong could be tightened for daily labor, loosened when the sun went down, or swapped for a fresh length if it chafed. Written sources and material studies indicate that footwear in Mesopotamia ranged from bare feet to wrapped sandals, with leather often used for those who needed more protection, and that fastening was almost always a matter of tying, threading, and adjusting with whatever strip or cord was at hand. This is not an elaborate tale of fashion, it is a patient catalogue of ordinary needs met by ordinary means. Punch a slit, thread a thong, tie the knot, repeat the ceremony every morning until habit makes it half-conscious. A small pause in the telling allows us to feel the tactile sequence: hand to thong, thong through slit, cord drawn and doubled, knot finished, an unremarkable choreography that kept people on their way. Further along the ribbon of time, in the island light and stone of the Greek world, sandals with thong-style fastenings appear in many contexts between the Bronze and Classical ages, from around 1500 BCE onward, in Minoan frescoes, Mycenaean depictions, and later classical examples. These straps and thongs behave more like a visible handwriting across the foot than a hidden seam. The thong, sometimes passing between the toes, sometimes split and routed across the forefoot, served both to anchor a sole and to present the foot's lines as part of a composed silhouette. In warm weather it was sensible to let air move around the foot while still keeping it secure, and the leather or woven strap answered that need with minimal fuss. Art and archaeology show an evolution of strap placement and complexity, with some sandals using simple toe loops and others wrapping higher around the ankle or crossing diagonally for a slightly firmer hold. Where more support was needed a series of straps would be employed, and where simplicity sufficed a single thong would do the job for many years. The mechanics remain gentle and familiar: a strap threaded, a knot taken, a bit of leather tucked away, and the foot is ready to travel. Slowly, with a hush between clauses, we observe how practicality and exposure mingle. The strap is both tool and ornament, pragmatic and visible, and therefore a small, quiet statement in a culture that loved balance and order. In regions of what we now call Mexico, the family of sandals known through later Spanish as huaraches has roots long predating European contact, with origins around 1200 BCE or earlier. Crafted from woven leather or plant fibers and often finished with lacing or straps that integrated into the sole, these sandals are an expression of local materials, weaving skills, and the simple need for a breathable, repairable shoe. Ethnographic and craft studies link huarache forms to pre-Columbian footwear traditions in several regions, each community adapting patterns of weaving and binding to the fibers they had at hand, whether split leather, agave-derived ixtal, or other plant cordage. While precise archaeological dates for specific huarache types vary regionally and are still the subject of study, the consensus among historians and craft scholars is that the style is pre-contact and deeply indigenous, with continuity into the colonial and modern periods where rural makers continued to weave and tie soles with great economy of material. The lacing on these sandals often weaves into the sole itself, so that the tie is not an add-on but part of the shoe structural grammar. A worn lace can be re-woven into the webbing, a frayed strand replaced by a fresh length plaited into place. In a soft hush of detail we feel the braided strap passing under the arch and around the ankle, offering security without suffocation, an intimate partnership of cord and sole shaped by climate, plant, and patient hands. Among the painted walls and bronze work of central Italy, Etruscan images in funerary goods record footwear forms that sometimes show enclosed boots and strapped sandals, and in tomb paintings from around 800 BCE and terracotta we can see how small holes and loops were employed to receive cords and laces as practical fastenings. Etruscan craftsmanship in leather and metal was sophisticated for its time, producing garments and accoutrements where functionality met careful finishing. A boot's throat may have been punched with small apertures to accept a drawstring, or little loops sewn to accept a thong, and the act of tying the boot into place seems, from the evidence, to have been an ordinary domestic skill rather than a ritual of dressing for display only. Archaeologists point to both imported influences and local developments, and art historians note how the Etruscans absorbed and reworked techniques from Greek and Near Eastern neighbors into a local vocabulary that included footwear closures adapted to local needs. The presence of these laced boots in tomb contexts suggests that the act of closing a boot was not accidental but habitual, a repeated domestic gesture that the deceased carried with them into the afterlife as a mark of everyday competence. With a soft, leisurely pause we trace the imagined motion, a cord entering a slit, a hand drawing it through, each crossing producing a steady, predictable tension until leather and leg agree. Turning to the structured marches of classical Rome, the caligae worn by soldiers around 500 BCE are a study in purposeful strapping, thick-soled sandals studded with hobnails and fastened by multiple leather straps that wrap the foot and lower leg to create a durable, repairable marching boot designed for distance and endurance. The caligae straps are not laces in the modern, threaded eyelet sense, but they perform the same work, anchoring a sole, stabilizing the foot, allowing ventilation, and enabling field repair. Where holes appear in military footwear, they are often simple slits or slots through which thongs pass, and soldiers could rethread or replace a broken thong with crude tools and a spare strip of leather. Military logistics and Roman supply practices emphasized uniformity and reparability, so footwear that could be adjusted and mended in an encampment was prized. The caligae reflects this logic, offering both the security of a well-tied foot and the ease of domestic repair when a thong snapped on the road. We breathe quietly at this practical image, a leather thong fed through a slot, tightened, and then tucked or tied, surviving mud, river crossings, and long days of marching by the strength of its simple fastening. In the landscapes of Britain and Ireland, finds and studies show that Celtic footwear of about 200 BCE employed a range of simple fastening devices, leather thongs, single-piece folded shoes, and occasionally toggle-style fastenings made from bone, wood, or cast metal, and that toggles and loop fasteners appear in the archaeological record as small but effective solutions. The toggle, a small bar or pierced bulb that could be passed through a loop or slit to hold materials together, shows up fairly often in finds dated to the late Iron Age and into Roman and early medieval contexts, sometimes as a clothing fastener and sometimes associated with harness or shoe equipment. These toggles were carved or cast to suit the available materials and the maker's skill, and they speak to an economy of reuse and practicality where a toggle could replace a more fiddly knot or bow in certain garments or footwear. In some leather shoes, a thong would loop around a toggle instead of being tied in a bow, giving a secure closure that stayed put without bulky knots. In wet climates this could be particularly useful, as the mechanism allowed easy unfastening without a prolonged fumbling. With a faint, thoughtful pause we imagine the toggle slipping through its slit and holding a leather tongue closed, a small technical choice that made daily dressing a little steadier and a little quicker, the kind of quiet adaptation that spreads by imitation across households and centuries. In the period of the Han and nearby centuries, cloth shoes worn across China by about 100 C commonly used stitched construction and were often closed or supported with cords, usually hemp, flax, or fine silk depending on status and region, so that a fabric upper could be tied to a pliant sole and adjusted according to the wearer's needs. Textile and burial evidence indicates that before cotton's widespread cultivation these earlier fibers were the norm for cordage and stitching, and that the cord which secured a cloth shoe might be sewn into a seam, passed through a small slit, or tied externally in a modest fashion. The choices depended on the type of shoe, the material available, and the climate. Scholars of costume note that the Han Dynasty produced a wide variety of footwear types, from stiff leather for riding and military uses to soft cloth for daily life, and that the cords or ties used with cloth shoes were selected for durability and comfort, with hemp offering strength and silk offering a smoother hand where budget allowed. The presence of these cords is not merely a stylistic curiosity, they affect how a shoe flexes, how it cushions the foot, and how a person dresses each morning. In a careful, hush-like cadence, we picture a narrow hemp cord drawn through a small opening and tied with a tidy knot, an unobtrusive yet utterly essential act that completed the making of a shoe into a wearable, mendable object. In the warm hush of 300 CE across the Indian subcontinent, leather and fiber met the foot with an unshowy tenderness, and cords did the simplest work imaginable, holding things together. Early Indian footwear included sandals and soft leather shoes secured by toe straps, toe loops, and ties that ran across the instep or circled the ankle, their cords plied from cotton or twisted plant fibers, their uppers cut from vegetable-tanned hides. Artisans who tanned with bark and fruit-rich solutions coaxed strength from cow, goat, or buffalo leather, then pierced small slits to receive a thong, or stitched little loops to anchor a lace. Quietly, the cord allowed adjustment for swelling and heat, for long walks on packed earth, for the gentle mechanics of daily life. Reliefs and painted textiles from later centuries echo earlier habits, the toe loop steadying the forefoot, the strap drawing the upper snug, a tied cord completing the fit. Shoelace knots were small, reef knots, half bows, simple wraps, chosen not for flourish, only for reliability. And when a lace wore through, it could be replaced in a moment, pulled from a new twist of cotton, a length of rawhide, or the soft inner bark of a local tree. Nothing here clamors for attention, every loop whispers utility. With an easy breath between steps, we glide from workshop to dusty lane, noticing how a single cord becomes a mild conversation between foot and shoe, a quiet promise that each step will hold as the day lengthens, and the air grows still. From the humid, leaf-shadowed paths of 500 C Mesoamerica, woven sandals of the Maya speak in fibers rather than in metals, and their language is steady, plant-born, and calm. Here, cords of agave and other hardy plants, strands split, dried, and twisted into ixtal, were braided into laces that wrapped the midfoot or circled the ankle, fastening soles woven from similar strands. The design was direct, a sole that could breathe in heat, a tie that could be retightened after a stream crossing, a knot that could be undone at day's end with a gentle pinch. Fibers taken from agave leaves offered a coarse grip that held its bow securely. Palm and other regional plants added their own textures, sometimes mixed, sometimes singly plied. Iconography and long craft tradition suggest a footwear rhythm adapted to fields, markets, and temples, each pair tuned by the wearer's own hand, each lace a modest tool. The cords could be spliced if frayed, lengthened by an extra twist, replaced with fresh fiber drawn like pale threads from a split leaf. Sandals hugged the foot without enclosing it, letting air move across skin with each unhurried step. No one hurried these knots, they were tied with the patience of woven mats and hammocks, with the same knowledge that plant fiber, treated kindly, lasts and lasts. With a slow turning of an invisible spindle, we notice how the laces and the soles share a single ancestry, how every step is cushioned by stalk and leaf, and how a quiet, repeatable motion, wrap, cross, tie, becomes the daily punctuation of walking. Along colder roads in 800 C Scandinavia, where damp grass gives way to packed earth and timber halls, leather shoes shaped by the turning method, stitched inside out, then turned right side, rest under benches while thongs wait in tidy loops. Excavations across Viking Age towns reveal practical closures, leather laces threaded through slits, toggles of horn or wood catching a loop, and narrow thong ties pulling a low instep cleanly shut. The hides, often cow or calf for soles, goat or cattle for uppers, were cut close to the last and stitched with waxed thread before being flipped right side, a small magic that hid seams from wear. Lacing did not seek ornament, it permitted fit. A shallow cut at the throat of the shoe offered 2 or 3 holes, a side slit offered an anchoring loop. The thong found its path and drew the leather close to the foot's curve, warm and forgiving after rain. Where paths grew boggy, patterns were not yet the answer, instead, a stout sole and a retie of a wet lace sufficed. The knots themselves were pragmatic, simple overhands, a quick wrap around a toggle, chosen for fingers chilled by northern winds. And when a thong snapped, a fresh strip could be skived from an offcut, smoothed by hand, threaded through the waiting slit. With a breath like mist over a fjord. The shoe sits quiet, its loops tidy, its thong unremarkable. Yet in that unremarkableness, we find a gentle precision, a closure that can be retied in the field, one that understands feet swell after marches and also settle by the hearth. On quiet lanes of 1000 CE Europe, the turnshoe becomes a soft companion to daily travel, and lacing learns to be both modest and precise. The shoemaker cuts uppers from supple leather, joins them to an outsole while the whole form is inside out, and flips the finished shoe so the smooth grain faces outward and the seam hides within. Laces and latchets, little wings of leather, do the last work, and opening at the instep closes with a thong, a series of slits welcomes a cord, and a small bow rests against the vamp. Because turnshoes are flexible, their fit relies on closure. The lace is not decoration but adjustment, changing with socks in winter, with bare feet in summer, with a day's swelling. Heels are low, soles thin, for mud and wear. A wooden pattern may come later, but the shoe itself remains quiet and pliant. Stitching is concealed, yet the lace is visible and helpful. Retie before the market, loosen for the evening walk home. Materials vary gently, cowhide for longevity, goat for softness, sometimes a split sole for thrift. The closures vary too, an instep slit, a side throat with 2 or 3 holes, or a tongue-like extension drawn close by a thong. With a pause as soft as wool. We can almost hear the shoemaker's awl and feel the slight give as a cord slides into a fresh punched slit. Nothing here is hurried. Even the knot waits until the foot settles inside its leather room, and then the lace, with small obedience, brings everything into place. Through sun-washed courtyards of 1100 CE Al-Andalus, leatherwork is a studied quiet, and cords become a graceful script across boots and shoes. Craftspeople in cities famed for fine hides developed closures that balanced elegance and utility, slits neatly punched, edges burnished, and narrow lacings drawn in tidy patterns across the instep. In workshops where hides were dyed with plant-based color and finished to a firm sheen, cord fastenings kept uppers close to the foot while allowing breath and movement in the heat. Latchets, that is, small side flaps with holes, invited a thread of leather or a braided cord to cross and tie, sometimes in a short series that gave a measured, geometric look. The influence of refined leatherwork in Iberia traveled outward with trade, and with it the everyday lesson that a lace could be both precise and serene. Boots meant for riding held the ankle with repeated, evenly spaced ties, soft shoes meant for indoor wear closed with a single gentle draw. The knot stayed small, the loops lay flat, because function asked for nothing more. With a calm shift of shadow under an arcade, we may picture fingers drawing the cord through its path, the holes aligned, the edges smooth to the touch. Not one motion is dramatic, and that lack of drama is the point. The fastening works today, and again tomorrow, the same path, the same result, as predictable as a courtyard fountain, as restful as afternoon shade. Across muddy tracks and timber keeps of 1200 CE Europe, the lace on a working boot becomes a straightforward companion, front-laced for clarity, sturdy for field and road. Riders favored higher shafts that could meet hose and guard the shin. Laborers used ankle-high boots cut for moving, climbing, and hauling. In both cases, the principle was consistent. A sequence of slits or small rounds along the front invited a leather thong or braided cord to cross in alternating steps, drawing the upper snug with each pull. Front lacing proved practical in cold and damp weather, easy to retie when fingers were stiff, easy to repair with an offcut if a lace snapped. The leather was most often cowhide for soles, a bit firmer for uppers, with thicker welt seams protected by the boot's structure. On long rides, a boot could be tightened at the top to reduce rubbing. On foot, it could be loosened slightly to allow blood to settle. Knights might slide armored sabatons over shoes for battle, but off the field, a laced boot answered the day's quieter demands. With a small, almost inaudible breath, we notice how the crossing pattern, left over right, right over left, creates a predictable tension, how each eye slit shares the work with its neighbors, and how the bow lies obediently near the tongue, ready to be undone when evening comes and the fire warms tired legs. Within the measured streets of 1300 CE towns, the shoe with an elongated, gently absurd point, known across Europe as the Krakow or Polaine, arrives with a lacing habit that is tidy and, in its way, serene. The vamp often hosts a short run of holes or slits, and a narrow lace crosses them to pull the upper into harmony with the foot beneath, while the exaggerated tip extends beyond the toes in a silhouette copied from courts and guildhalls alike. Decorative laces appear too, small bindings that are practical yet not afraid to be seen, sometimes ending in neat tips to ease threading. The point itself might be lightly stuffed to hold shape, but the fastening remains ordinary, a sequence of crossings, a bow that rests below the ankle, a knot made to be untied. Sumptuary laws in some places will later address the length of those points, but lacing carries on, indifferent to fashions at the tip. As the wearer walks, the lace manages flexion at the instep, preventing gaping and smoothing each step's roll. With the gentlest turn of the wrist, we can imagine how a shoemaker chooses spacing for each hole, how a too wide gap would fatigue the cord, how a too narrow run would stiffen the vamp. The right distance is quietly learned, kept in the hand, transferred to the leather, and then repeated pair after pair, so that the crossing lines look almost like a small ladder laid over the shoe's breathing, living curve. Under the soft gray of 1400 CE English skies, cordwainers, shoemakers working fine leathers, take familiar lace holes and make them more dependable by craft rather than novelty. They punch clean apertures, pare edges, wax the thread that binds the opening's rim, and sometimes whipstitch the circumference so the hole keeps its shape and does not tear under repeated pulls. Laces themselves are improved by habit, narrow leather thongs cut with the grain for strength, or cords of linen or silk given a little wax to resist fray. Aglets, small tips applied to the ends of laces, become helpful, letting the cord pass smoothly through each hole and discouraging unraveling. Guilds formalize standards of cut and finish, and in that careful formality, everyday durability improves. The hole does not need to be metal ringed, it simply needs to be cleanly made and properly bound, and then it will accept a lace again and again with the same soft resistance. With a pause as gentle as rain on a shop eve. We notice how minor details, hole spacing, edge finishing, the way a thong is skived, quietly govern how easily a boot closes on a cold morning. The cord obeys the hole respects the cord. And beneath that cooperation, the foot finds steadiness, the kind that turns long walks into unremarkable journeys, which is to say, the most comforting kind of all. Across Central and Eastern European roads by 1450 CE, images and surviving examples describe high leather boots laced in crisscross patterns up the shin, a steady, ascending geometry that served both riders and walkers. In Polish towns and courts, sturdy hides were cut into tall shafts with rows of slits or small punched openings, and cords threaded back and forth to distribute tension evenly from instep to calf. This cross-lacing kept the shaft upright, reduced rubbing, and allowed the wearer to fine-tune fit over hose or wraps, a necessity in climates that shifted from wet to frost with quiet regularity. The bow might rest at the top or be tucked aside, the crossings below held the structure, each diagonal sharing the work with its neighbor. Travel, trade, and military service encouraged such practical designs, and the laced boot answered with predictability. When swelling required relief, 2 steps of unlacing gave it; when support was needed, 2 steps of tightening restored it. With a soft draw of air, as if looking across fields towards Krakow, we see the calm logic of repeated diagonals, the way leather remembers where it has been tightened, the way a well-cut slit accepts a cord without nicking it. Nothing about these boots asks for spectacle. They ask only to close around a leg in the same way today, and then again tomorrow, untroubled by anything except the next road and the next small, ordinary knot. Amid the measured fashions of 1500 CE England, early Tudor shoes lean into ties that are not merely thongs but ribbons, soft, flat, and, for the wealthy, woven of silk that glides through tiny openings with a faint whisper. Shoes with latchets, those small side flaps, invite a ribbon to cross the instep and form a bow, sometimes adorned with a rosette that sits like a quiet flourish against the leather. The well-to-do choose fine calf for uppers and smoother soles, and the ribbon laces become signs of refinement rather than necessity, though they still do their first job, closing the shoe reliably, allowing breath, allowing adjustment. For daily use, linen or leather ties remain common, but in halls and courts the silk ribbon's flat hand is kind to the fingers and the eye. Openings are cleanly punched and often reinforced by stitching. The ribbon's ends may be finished with small tips so they pass easily through their path. With the gentlest turn of candlelight on polished floors, we notice how a bow tied in silk lies flatter than one in round thong, how the knot can be snug without biting, and how a wearer might, in a moment of quiet, retie for a slightly better balance across the vamp. Nothing urgent moves here. A ribbon found its proper hole, crossed its mate, and settled into a soft ornament that still holds the shoe steady. Step by calm step, the lace remains what it has always been, a small negotiator between foot and leather, content to be noticed or not, content, most of all, to do its unassuming work. In the hush of a courtyard paved with river-worn stones, picture Spanish chopines of the mid-16th century, those high little platforms that raised a wearer as if on a slow, private stage. The chapine often sat like a small, architectural secret beneath a skirt, and it was sometimes held to the foot with ties, thongs, or narrow cords that threaded through a split vamp or around a raised sole. These shoes were not made for running, they were made for keeping hems from the mud, for altering the cadence of a step just enough to be proper in a slow, deliberate world, and the ties that kept them close were practical companions, leather or textile cords knotted in simple manners or tucked away beneath fabric. Makers sometimes added small rows of punched holes or little loops so that a ribbon or thong could hold the upper together, and in places like Spain and Venice the chapine's very height could influence how tight or loose those ties needed to be, because balance matters even when one moves with the decorum of a gentle ceremony. Craftspeople worked bark tanned leather and woven textiles into uppers, then added the straps and cordage that would secure the foot. When a cord frayed it was replaced by a fresh length cut from an offcut, or by a strip of leather softened at the edges. The chapine's ties were therefore humble but essential, and while the platform may draw the eye in a portrait, the lace and thong did the unglamorous work of keeping the shoe attached so the wearer might cross a marble floor or a muddy lane with equal modesty. In that quiet practicality we find the same patient logic we have admired elsewhere, an object made to last a while, mendable with a small knife and a patient hand, and content to perform the same reliable task day after day. Beneath a soft canopy of speculation about late Renaissance habits, we find that by around 1600 in parts of Europe leather boots and other footwear often bore small metal tips or sheaths on their ties, aglets, which helped prevent fraying and made the narrow laces easier to feed through punched holes or narrow slits. Metal aglets and decorative points had been in use long before this date in various forms, but through the 16th and 17th centuries they appear in clothing inventories and archaeological finds as both practical and ornamental little endings, sometimes plain, sometimes stamped or formed from rolled metal. They ease the repetition of threading and rethreading that daily life demanded. Shoemakers and their assistants would cut thongs of leather, wax thread, or fine linen cord, then finish the tips with a bit of manufactured metal or wrapped material so the lace would not unravel after months of use, a small economy of attention that saved a great many fiddly repairs. Contemporary finds from early modern households and later museum collections show aglets in copper alloy and other metals, which quietly point to a long history of the little problem-solving devices we now hardly notice. The presence of those metal tips changed a small domestic ritual. Lacing became a simpler, less fussy movement, and the neatness of the laces and became one more small measure of the maker's care. So we notice, with the gentlest curiosity, how a tiny sheath at the end of a cord can make the difference between a morning's slow, steady readiness and a day started with an unnecessary fuss. In the hush of salons and sunlit parquet floors across mid-17th century France, the court shoe took on a faintly different temperament. Ties and ribbons became a soft language of refinement, where silk ribbons threaded through small latchets or simple holes would close the shoe and also provide a gentle surface ornament, a little whisper of wealth that lay flat across the instep. Shoemakers working for courts and wealthy patrons used finer leathers and satin coverings, and the ribbons chosen to bind those shoes were often silk or finely woven linen, tied in modest bows that were meant to be seen but not to shout. Portraiture and surviving examples in museum collections show fastening systems that are not purely functional, they are composed with an eye to proportion, to how a narrow ribbon will lie across polished floors and catch candlelight in a whisper, rather than in a glitter. For indoor wear the ribbon could be softer and flatter than a leather thong, and for ceremonial uses it added a deliberate, decorative note to what remained, at base, the practical business of keeping a shoe closed on a foot. Where a ribbon replaced a rough thong, the motion of tying became a gentler, almost domestic ritual, a knot secured, ends trimmed, a neat tidy balance across the vamp. Thus the shoe's aesthetic and its purpose agreed, quietly and without fuss, while the hands that tied them moved with practiced calm in a room that had no need of haste. With a slow-minded curiosity we glance toward the 18th century and see that armies and governments, being careful people, began to insist on a certain sameness of dress. By the 1700s military uniforms across Europe were subject to regulations and issued clothing, and boots and shoes were part of that effort toward consistency, which in turn meant more regular patterns of fastening such as laced boots for certain roles. The standardization of military attire did not spring fully formed overnight, but rather arrived as a series of clothing warrants, supply lists, and regulations that, taken together, created a world in which a soldier's boots had to be serviceable, repairable, and reasonably interchangeable among ranks and units. Lacing patterns that were easy to teach, quick to retie in the field, and simple to repair with a strip of leather became valued traits in a boot intended for marching and routine duty. Gaiters, long coats, and particular colors were regulated, and the same administrative care often extended to footwear. Clear expectations simplified supply and repair in a regiment, and a predictable method of fastening reduced unnecessary variety. The lace was a small but important element in this system. It allowed a single boot designed to fit different leg wraps and to be adjusted when swelling or mud obliged a change. In the quiet order of military stores and the even rhythm of an issued uniform, the lace quietly served the needs of a soldier's day without drama, and that steadiness, method over ornament, was the very thing uniform regulations sought. As the American colonies settled into their long, practical days in the early 18th century, work boots and sturdy footwear often relied on strong leather thongs or rawhide laces, materials chosen for their ready availability and their capacity to be repaired quickly by a cobbler or the owner. Rawhide, being simply dried and sometimes smoothed hide, could be split into durable thongs that resisted the abrasion of fieldwork. When tied in a simple crossing pattern along an ankle or instep, such laces held a boot together through digging, hauling, and the occasional river crossing. Provision lists and surviving accounts from colonial stores show that many households kept spare cords, strips of leather, and length of rope for making or mending footwear, an economy of parts that made sense in a place where the nearest shop might be a market day away. Boots for labor were not made to be delicate, they were made to be serviceable, and that meant a preference for laces that could be skived from an offcut and replaced without the fuss of finding a matching ribbon. The tactile memory of a hand working a thong through a slit, the small satisfaction when the lace holds firm against a loaded wagon, and the quiet ceremony of replacing a worn lace by the hearth are the modest rituals of labor that keep communities moving. In these simple acts the lace is not fashion but maintenance, and that domestic seam of care is a story worth telling in the softest voice. Turning our attention to the stony hills and peat-rich fields of Scotland, the gilly brogue takes shape in a design that delights in draining and drying. Historically, these brogue-like shoes feature open lacing and often no tongue so that water could escape and the shoe could dry more quickly after crossing wet ground. The lacing in such designs typically rises above the ankle or wraps around it, helping the shoe stay close to the foot without trapping mud and moisture within, and the pattern of perforations, broguing, was originally practical rather than merely decorative. Early examples and regional descriptions suggest these shoes were built for country use, deerskin or other hides cut and stitched into a simple wrap, the laces threaded through eyelets or tied above the ankle so that the shoe would not snag in heather or bog. Over time the gillies aesthetic was retained even as the shoe became ceremonial for Highland dress, but the underlying logic remains the same: open systems, long laces, and the absence of a tongue reduce trapped moisture and aid quick drying, which is precisely what the upland walker needed. The quiet geometry of the lace, its crossing, its long free ends, reads like a practical poem of movement across wet land, and in the hush of a peat-smelling morning we can almost hear the soft whisper of leather forgiving a foot and then setting it free to step again. A patient glance at the small metal details of the late 18th century shows that by around the 1770s metal tips and small chappes, aglets and their cousins, had become reasonably common on the ends of ribbons and cords worn as dress or used in everyday fastening. They were made in brass, copper alloys, and tin, and found on everything from practical boot laces to the ornamental aiguillettes that decorated garments. Archaeological finds and period garments show rolled metal points and simple sheaths used to protect cord ends and ease threading, and costume collections from the period give us plenty of examples where a neat metal point made a dressing ritual easier and neater. Craftspeople working in small workshops could produce these tips by rolling thin sheet metal, by casting small chappes, or by crimping formed tubes over the raw end of a lace, and such practices improve the life of a cord as surely as a small, exacting stitch prolongs a seam. The brass or tin used for these tiny finishes offered a little weight, a little protection from abrasion, and a faint glint that was pleasing but unobtrusive in ordinary life. Thus, the aglet in its 18th century forms quietly performed two tasks at once: it preserved the structure of the cord, and it made the repeated, domestic act of threading and tying simpler, which is to say, calmer. In the calendar of inventions, the year 1790 is often given a small notation for the modern shoestring. An English maker commonly named Harvey Kennedy is widely credited in secondary sources with patenting a version of the shoelace with finished tips around March of that year, a claim repeated in many modern histories and summaries of lace history. It is worth saying, gently and with proper caution, that while many references credit Kennedy with a formal patent that popularized the modern combination of lacing and finished tips, aglets, points and small metal terminations on cords had long been used in Europe for both function and decoration, the so-called patent marks a moment of commercial recognition and wider adoption rather than the invention ex nihilo of laces. Contemporary chroniclers and later retellings note that Kennedy's improvement made life easier by preventing fraying and making threading swifter, and that industrializing and popularizing such a small device helped the shoes of an increasingly mobilized and urban population. The story is not dramatic, it is modest, a measure of how small innovations, when taken up by many hands, can quietly change a domestic habit, rendering an ordinary tie less fiddly and therefore less likely to interrupt the slow, dependable continuity of daily life. Around the year 1800 CE, the shape of what people called a boot softened and tightened at once, and in the hush of those years lace-up boots began to creep from practical military work into polite fashion. The Duke of Wellington's modest riding preference nudged a high, close-fitting boot into public life, and by about 1804 half boots and walking boots with front lacing were being shown in fashion plates and museum collections as sensible daytime wear. Picture, if you will, a quiet morning street, leather slightly scuffed by dew, a small series of eyelets or stitched buttonholes marching up a boot's throat, a lace threaded through like a slow, obedient river. This adoption was not sudden, but a gradual migration. Soldiers' tight riding boots, with their snug fit for stirrup work, offered a practical silhouette that tailors and cobblers translated for civilians. The boots' shaping, low heels, and later modest decoration made it suitable for walking dress as well as riding. We take a slow breath and look closely at the mechanics. The lacing permitted a closer fit than a slip-on, distributed pressure across the instep, allowed for domestic mending, and offered tiny opportunities for modest ornament, ribbons or stitched trim tucked under a flap. In an unhurried aside, we note that these early fashion laces were often leather or textile strips, sometimes threaded through little loops or narrow handmade eyelets rather than the punched, reinforced holes we think of now. They were practical, adaptable, and repairable. Allow a small pause here, a soft intake of air, and imagine the cobbler with a needle and awl, reseating a worn lace with patient hands beside the hearth. The act of lacing a boot became a domestic ritual as ordinary as pouring tea, and that steady repetition is how styles quietly take root. Softly, around 1820 CE, Britain's textile workshops hummed with new machines that translated handwork into steady, repeating motion, and among these inventions were lace weaving and braiding technologies whose indirect effect was to make cords and laces far easier to produce in quantity. The bobbinet and other early lace machines, John Heathcote's bobbinet patent and its improvements in the early 1800s are a gentle example, copied by mechanical means the hand movements of lacemakers and thus produced net and narrow fabrics efficiently. Think of a mill room, slow gears turning, threads fed like soft rivers into a machine that returns a tiny tube or braid. This is the industrial origin story of many textile cords. With an attentive, mild voice we note the little technical distinctions. A braiding machine, sometimes called a maypole braider, produces round, braided cords ideal for shoestrings. Bobbinet and levers type machines produce net and lace grounds that could be edged into decorative or structural trims. These mechanical developments did not instantly replace handwork, quite the opposite, but they lowered costs, improved uniformity, and made it practical for a middle-class shoemaker to stock cotton or braided cords rather than always trimming hides to strips. In a soft detour of thought, we observe how the material change influenced tying habits. Textile laces knot differently from leather, they hold wax and coatings more readily, and so the design of a shoe's fastening quietly co-evolved with the capacity of looms and braiders. Breathe, and picture a spool turning into a braid, the kind of small innovation that slowly changes how ordinary people lace their shoes. On the question of patents and names, one must be careful and kind to the facts. The modern, aglet-tipped shoelace, often credited in popular retellings to an English inventor, is associated with a patent and popularization in the late 18th century rather than the early 1820s, and most reliable historical notes point to Harvey Kennedy's work being recorded in 1790 as a formative moment when aglets and a more recognizably modern shoelace design entered the record. Gently, with the patience of someone methodically turning a page, we acknowledge that laces themselves are ancient, but the little metal or hardened tips, aglets, that make threading and thread life easier became a notable improvement. Contemporaries remarked on how these tips made the act of feeding a lace through a hole simpler and less prone to fray, and so the small mechanical convenience spread. Allow a soft pause while we consider the matter of evidence. The historical record here is patchy, often filtered through catalogs of curiosities and later histories, yet the recurring appearance of the 1790 date in costume histories, museum notes, and etymological entries makes it a cautiously reliable marker for when this particular packaged form of lace gained attention in England. In a tender aside, we also appreciate the economics, the aglet's simple function, protecting the end of a cord, reduced wastage in labor and lacing, a minor efficiency that mattered in an age when threads and small metal fittings were becoming industrially available. So we hold the date, quietly corrected and gently stated, as a waypoint in the long history of fastening, an incremental, sensible improvement that made lacing a little easier for many hands. Turning inward to the 1830s, a time when ankle boots with lacing became particularly prevalent in European urban wardrobes, we observe a pattern of practical fashion that balances modest support with social ease. Museum collections note that the ankle boot was dominant for women's outdoor wear from the 1830s into the later Victorian decades, and so the laced ankle boot becomes a familiar silhouette in city streets and country lanes alike. Picture a narrow, straight-sided boot rising just above the ankle, its throat fitted with small eyelets or side lacing, sometimes using small buttons and sometimes tiny loops, and consider how the lacing here acts less as a bold ornament and more as a technical convenience, holding a slender sole and thin upper in sympathetic agreement with the wearer's movement. We pause, curiously, to appreciate distribution and manufacture. By this time, ready-made boots, patterns, and the beginnings of factory production made such boots more accessible, while bespoke makers still offered finely fitted versions. In an amiable aside, we remark on the tactile differences, how front lacing moved from a practical necessity to a style cue, how side lacing offered a sleeker front profile, and how different classes signaled status through materials and small embellishments like stitching or a cameo-like button. With a soft inhalation, imagine the small domestic choreography of tying side-laced boots on a chilly morning, fingers smoothing leather, a tug here and there to equalize tension, a knot tucked away so it does not catch on skirts or gaiters. Such modest ritual is where utility and quiet fashion meet, and that, in itself, was a kind of comfort for wearers who liked things to sit properly on their feet as they moved through a very slow, crowded world. Gently, as we wander through mid-century innovations, by about 1840 cloth laces, cotton in particular, had become an increasingly common alternative to leather strips for many shoes in Europe, and this shift was supported by wider changes in thread availability and textile technicalities. Cotton spinning and weaving, which expanded greatly in the wake of mechanized mills, made cotton cord and braided cotton laces affordable enough to replace leather in many everyday uses. Let us pause and examine the quiet mechanics of the swap. Cotton is less resistant to wet than leather, but it knots with a different frictional quality. It accepts wax and starch coatings to become stiffer and more durable, and it can be mass-produced in uniform diameters so that a shoemaker can predict how much lace will be needed for a given pattern. Textual summaries of lace and textile history note that after 1800 cotton threads became more common in lacemaking and related narrow textiles, and the practical consequence for footwear is obvious: lighter, cheaper, and more flexible laces that suit the delicate materials of fashionable boots and shoes as readily as the stouter constructions of work footwear. In a soft aside, we note how material properties shape behavior. Cotton's rougher surface often holds knots more willingly than some smooth leathers, and so tying conventions evolved gently alongside materials. Breathe with me now at this small fact: the choice of a lace fiber is not mere trivia but a quiet engineering preference, and that preference affected how people tied their shoes each morning and how a cobbler stocked his little shop. In a careful, domestic voice we come to around 1850 CE in the United States, where children's footwear increasingly adopted small lace-up boots as a common solution for growing, active feet. Museum collections and textile archives preserve pairs of little boots and shoes from the mid-19th century that show side lacing, front lacing, and small eyelets fitted for slender cords. Let us linger on that scene: a parent or caregiver fastening a small pair of leather or cloth boots on a child, threading a lace through narrow holes, tying a modest knot that resists untimely loosening while not being so tight as to pinch. The spread of lace-up children's footwear is closely tied to changing ideas about child dress in the Victorian period. Boots were durable, protective, and adaptable as feet grew, and to the availability of mass-produced shoewear in New England and other industrial regions where factories began to make small boots in numbers. We pause to note the interplay of manufacture and daily life. Factories produced many identical uppers and soles, while laces and small fittings could be supplied cheaply, making lace-up styles accessible beyond the wealthy. Simultaneously, hand-fitted children's shoes persisted for those who could afford them. In the soft hush that follows, consider the practical benefits. Lace-up shoes can be adjusted for swelling, for growth, and for comfort, attributes that made them sensible for children who walked, climbed, and lived a less sedentary life than many later generations. The act of lacing a child's boot becomes, in this mild telling, a small ritual of care. We slow to the era of the American Civil War, circa 1860 CE, where military necessity and industrial capacity meet in the form of standardized, lace-up boots for soldiers. Records and manufacturing histories indicate that, by this time, armies sought boots that could be produced in quantity, repaired in the field, and adjusted on the foot for long marches, and lace-up boots fit these needs. With a gentle, measured tone we consider the boot as equipment. A lace threaded through a series of eyelets or slits distributes pressure, allows the wearer to tighten or loosen for marching versus rest, and can be replaced or rethreaded when a thong breaks. In the industrializing regions of New England and elsewhere, shoe factories scaled up production of both footwear and the cords that fastened them, meaning that soldiers' boots could be issued with standard laces, and spare laces could be stocked in supply wagons. Allow a quiet pause to picture an encampment scene, a boot relaced beside a small fire, a soldier using a spare leather thong or braided cotton cord to mend a broken fastening, the simplicity of the solution making long supply lines less urgent. Modern makers and reenactors who study Civil War footwear emphasize that lacing practices were practical, not decorative. The rope-like utility of laces and the ability to effect field repair were campaign value features, and that plain effectiveness is, in its own way, a kind of understated elegance. In a quiet, documentary way we reach about 1870 CE, and the rise of true mass-produced eyelets and grommets for lacing. The 19th century's industrial presses and eyelet-setting machines made reinforced metal eyelets and grommets widely affordable, and contemporary reports from manufacturing towns note large-scale production of these tiny metal rings. Pause with me to consider the smallness of the innovation. An eyelet is merely a ring, but when it is stamped and set by machine it protects the fabric or leather from tearing, it standardizes the hole size for a lace to pass through, and it reduces the labor of making hand-stitched reinforcing holes. Newspaper accounts in museum collections from the period record factories devoted to producing eyelets in astonishing quantities, and patent and trade literature show that eyelet presses and dedicated machines were circulating through workshops and offices by the mid to late 19th century. We breathe softly on the thought that such mechanization turned a previously bespoke detail into a commodity. Shoes could now be built with predictable, durable holes for laces, and that predictability made mass production of both footwear and laces simpler. In an almost conspiratorial hush, one might say the little metal eyelet quietly made lacing more reliable for everyone, from the soldier to the city clerk, and that is the small, domestic impact of industrial pressing and stamping. In a slow span toward the close of the 19th century we touch on experiments with elasticated cords for footwear, a small thread of innovation that runs beside the larger story of laces. Elastic materials, vulcanized rubber and braided elastic bands, became technologically possible in the 19th century, and inventors experimented with elastic fastenings, suspenders, and even elastic features in footwear across Britain and beyond. We breathe in and notice the technical milestones, the refinement of rubber processing and the patents for elastic fastenings in the early 19th century made it possible, in principle, to consider elastic cords as alternatives to inelastic cotton or leather laces. In practice, elasticized closures appeared intermittently, as elastic-sided boots and as elastic inserts in garments, long before elastic shoelaces became a consumer staple, and inventors and makers tested various braided or covered elastic cords for comfort and resilience. Let us allow a tiny detour of curiosity. Elastic changes the user experience of lacing because it permits a snug, adaptable hold without constant retying, but it also requires different end fittings and sometimes different eyelet treatments to prevent rapid wear. Thus, while elastic cords were indeed experimented with in the 19th century, broad adoption for shoelaces awaited improvements in elastic durability and the later industrial processes of the 20th century. We close this paragraph with a gentle fact: elastic's story in footwear is parallel to that of laces, an incremental material experiment that would quietly reshape convenience when the times and the materials were ready. Around the hush of the close of the 19th century, sport shoes began to appear as small, sensible experiments between court and street, and by about 1890 CE what people called tennis shoes or plimsolls were taking shape: low, flat-soled canvas shoes with rubber bottoms that were meant to be light, breathable, and easy to walk in. In those first, hesitant decades the lacings were usually simple cotton cords, soft in the fingers, a little dusty after play, easy to knot and to replace. Imagine a sun-warmed lawn, the secretive sound of a ball struck out of sight, and a pair of white canvas shoes tied with modest cotton lace, the lace not a fashion statement so much as an honest little tool, tying vamp to sole and foot to ground. The vocabulary around these shoes smells faintly of nautical metaphors, plimsoll borrowed from a ship's marking, and the design traveled from leisure courts into everyday life because it solved a small, recurrent problem: how to keep a flexible canvas upper from gaping when you walked, and how to tighten a shoe to a foot without fuss. Cotton worked well enough, it was widely available, inexpensive, and its texture held knots kindly. Worn cotton laces took on a lived-in softness that matched the fabric of the shoe, and they could be rethreaded while the player paused between sets or replaced by a parent at home. In quiet technical terms, the appearance of these laced sports shoes marks a shift. Shoelacing moved from hidden function to visible, repeatable choreography, and the cotton lace became the small, obedient instrument of that choreography. Somewhere near the turn of the century in America, canvas and rubber footwear that resembled British plimsolls began to be made and worn, and although the tidy brand snapshot you might later hear, Keds, only formally entered the market a little later, the practical form of canvas sneakers with laces was already circulating. Canvas allowed breadth and lightness, while a rubber sole supplied grip, and a cotton lace finished the assembly with a forgiving, adjustable closure. The company that would become famous as Keds was established by the United States Rubber Company in 1916, and that debut brought a particular, mass-produced sensibility to the laced canvas shoe in the United States, a ready-to-wear pair that used simple laces to secure the foot, intended for everyday sports and casual wear rather than heavy labor. Before, during, and after that moment, enterprising shoemakers and small manufacturers were experimenting with canvas and rubber combinations, trading leather's weight for canvas's ease and giving laces a new domestic role: quick to thread, easy to mend, and cheap enough to replace when worn. The lace itself remained unglamorous, cotton, braided, sometimes wax-treated for a stiffer hand, but its ubiquity in these early sneakers is important. It turned a shoe into an object that could be sized and fitted more finely without bespoke work. Picture a small factory table, spools of thread, a handful of braided cotton laces being measured and trimmed, ready to be fed through eyelets. The lace is both a technical detail and the quiet interface between foot and shoe in a time when comfortable, casual footwear was becoming part of everyday life. In a soft, earnest note about names and beginnings, the firm that would become Converse was founded in 1908 CE, and the particular model that later became famous as the All-Star was introduced in 1917 CE. The All-Star's high-top canvas form and lace-up arrangement would go on to influence both sport and streetwear. The early Converse designs were practical, built with a canvas upper and a vulcanized rubber sole, and the decision to make them lace-up was straightforward. Laces permitted a close, adjustable fit and allowed the shoe to serve both casual players and athletes who wanted more ankle control. Over the years, the All-Star was refined with suggestions from basketball players and salesmen, most famously Charles Chuck Taylor, and the simple lace-up pattern remained central to its function and identity. When you imagine those early court floors and gymnasia, Think of hands threading cotton laces through metal-rimmed holes or through stitched eyelets, pulling an upper snug so the shoe would not slip when pivoting or running. The lace here is the quiet technician of performance. It anchors a flexible canvas to a moving foot, it can be tightened after a long day's use, and when a lace frays it is a simple domestic matter to replace it without changing the entire shoe. In this small, patient invention, a canvas shoe and a lace that secures it, you can hear the slow conversation between comfort, manufacture, and mobility that defines early 20th century footwear. In the heavy, sodden years that began in 1914, military footwear responded to mud, cold, and the need for quick repair, and the boots worn by soldiers were commonly laced in patterns that balanced security with the ability to be mended in the field. The archetypal trench boot, which American histories often connect to models later described as Pershing or M1917/M1918 boots as supply and design evolved during the war years, took seriously the problems of wet trenches, long marches, and the brittleness of ordinary civil footwear when exposed to battle conditions. Thick leather uppers, reinforced stitching, and multiple closures or long straps worked together with laces or thongs so that weary soldiers could tighten for marching and loosen for rest, and perhaps most practically, could replace a broken lace with any strip of leather or braided cord on hand. The act of lacing a boot in the mud becomes in the mind's eye an exacting, calm ritual: thread, pull, cross, tuck, and then move on, because the boot must hold for another mile. These wartime demands encouraged shoemakers and military supply to think about durability in small detail: stronger eyelets or punched slits, thicker lace material, and the standardization of patterns that made repair parts interchangeable across regiments. In the hush of an encampment after a cold night, the kneeling motion to relace a boot is less drama than domestic competence. It is the same small string work that household cobblers had practiced for centuries, adapted now to the needs of armies and fields. With a soft shift into the more polished lanes of the 1920s, formal leather dress shoes, including the Oxford styles that rose in popularity for both men and women, frequently used thin, waxed cotton laces to achieve a slim, neat closure appropriate to evening and daytime dress alike. Waxing a cotton lace, a small but meaningful treatment, stiffens the thread slightly, helps repel moisture, and gives the lace a discreet sheen so that it disappears into the shoe's vamp as much as it secures it. Tailors and shoemakers appreciated this because it allowed fabric and leather to read as a continuous surface interrupted only by an obedient, tidy knot. The aesthetic of the period, linear, often quite restrained, meant that laces for dress shoes were narrow, round or slightly oval in cross-section, and carefully finished so ends did not fray and so knots would sit flat beneath a neat throat. Detail matters: the diameter of the lace must match the hole size. A too thick lace will bunch and spoil the line, a too thin lace will look mean and tangle. Waxing gives a middle ground of control. Buyers and wearers found that waxed cotton laces could be purchased in uniform lengths and thicknesses, making replacement a small domestic errand rather than bespoke work. Imagine a quiet dressing table in morning light, a pair of thin waxed laces placed beside a brush, tidy and ready to be threaded through neat eyelets, a routine that prepares the wearer for the day without fuss. A gentle, almost decorative breeze wandered through the 1920s with fashion's experiments in color and novelty, and by around 1923 the idea of laces as a styling opportunity, not merely a fastener, was beginning to take hold in some circles. Dyed and colored laces started to be used to harmonize with or subtly contrast shoes and hosiery, especially in more playful or fashionable contexts where color blocking and coordinated outfits were prized. While many ordinary shoes retained sober shades of leather and conservative ties, fashion houses and adventurous bootmakers produced laces in hues that matched trims, and some makers sold laces as accessories meant to be swapped and updated as one might replace a ribbon or a brooch. The practicalities are simple yet telling. Dyeing laces allowed for a small, removable embellishment that could be washed or replaced when faded. It cost less than remaking a shoe, and it enabled the same pair of shoes to be given a slightly different mood without altering the construction. The cloth and ribbon industries that supplied trims and millinery found an adjacent market among shoemakers, and the result is a quiet proliferation of color in inexpensive places. A shoe's lace could be a discreet signal of personal taste or seasonal preference, and in that unobtrusive way laces began to talk in color as well as in knot. In a slow climb toward technical demands, the surge of mountaineering activity in the early 20th century prompted more purposeful thinking about boots and laces, and by the 1930s climbers and alpine boot makers were reinforcing both the eyelets and the laces themselves to cope with cold, abrasion, and the loads of crampons and ropework. Early alpinists used heavy leather boots with hobnailed soles, and as routes grew more ambitious makers experimented with stronger braided laces, thicker materials that resisted cut and wet, and eyelet arrangements that allowed for secure heel locking and easy adjustment on steep approaches. The lace in this context is no mere ornament, it is part of a system that transfers forces, stabilizes the ankle, and resists abrasion when caught against rock. Braided cotton gave way in places to waxed preparations and, eventually, to synthetic braids designed for tensile strength. Metal hooks and reinforced rings allowed quick retensioning at belays. Mountaineering literature, guides, and surviving boots from the era show how small technical changes, a stronger lace, a better placed hook, could lengthen a rope team's day by making boots steadier and less prone to sudden slippage or cut through. In the quiet language of gear, then, laces and their fittings became another part of the climber's toolkit, humble, mendable, and indispensable when the slope steepened. When the second global conflict spread in the 1940s, the necessities of scale and endurance again pushed boot making, and the laces that closed those boots, toward greater robustness. From Europe to the Pacific, military footwear was demanded in numbers and had to be repairable under austere conditions, so laces and fastenings were specified to resist abrasion, mud, and repeated retying. Armies favored tougher cordage, thicker leather thongs, or braided cottons that could be knotted securely and would not fray after long marches. Factories produced laces to standards that prioritized wear resistance and interchangeability, and supply systems kept spares for quick field repair. The choreography of relacing at a regimental campfire is a quiet image. A soldier cuts a replacement from a leather scrap, threads it through, pulls the tension to match the other foot, and tucks the end away so it will not snag in underbrush. Beyond materials, the war encouraged improvements in eyelets, heel counters, and the general engineering of a boot so that lacing patterns could be standardized and parts could be interchanged across many thousands of pairs. The lace in wartime is utilitarian to the point of being unsentimental. It exists to hold a heavy machine of leather and sole to a living, sweating foot, and its success is measured in miles walked rather than applause. Softly in the calm of a recovering post-war world, the 1950s witnessed a broad expansion of sportswear into everyday life and a consequent boom in sneakers and athletic shoes. Cotton laces remained common on many popular styles during this era, because cotton was inexpensive, comfortable, and suited to the largely canvas and rubber constructions that dominated early post-war sneakers. The social conditions of the time, more leisure, more school sports, and the manufacturing capacity to produce shoes in large numbers, meant that lace-up sneakers became nearly universal for sporting occasions and casual wear, and the familiar ritual of crossing cotton laces through eyelets before a game or a morning walk belonged to both children and adults. These laces, while humble, were subject to small technical refinements, wax coatings to resist fray, slight variations in braid tightness to alter knot holding, and standardized length for common shoe patterns so a shoemaker or parent could replace them without fuss. In domestic scenes, the act of lacing a child's shoe or tying a sneaker before a morning game reads as both care and quiet preparation. The cotton lace is a little domestic bridge between manufacture and the daily life it serves. In a final hush of industrial change that reaches toward the modern materials age, the mid-20th century saw synthetics begin to replace natural fibers in many small textile applications, and by about 1960 polyester and other man-made fibers were being used for shoelaces alongside cotton and leather. Synthetic laces offered several technical advantages: improved uniformity, resistance to rot and mildew, and the ability to be produced in a wide palette of colors without the same fading concerns as natural fibers. Nylon, introduced earlier in the century, and polyester yarns were braided into stable, low-fray cords that accepted coatings and aglets well, and manufacturers adopted these materials as they sought lower costs and greater performance in wet or harsh conditions. The arrival of synthetic laces also changed user experience subtly. They knot differently, they slide through eyelets with less friction, and they can be engineered with specific stretch or stiffness profiles to suit athletic uses or fashion demands. In the hush of machines and looms, the lace's evolution from plant and hide to polymer is a quiet industrial story, one that transformed a small, domestic object into a mass-produced, reliably performing part of everyday life. Drifting into the early mists of the 1970s, as outdoor recreation quietly wove itself into American life, hiking boots underwent subtle evolutions, and the laces that held them in place were part of that story. By around 1970 CE, nylon cords had become a preferred choice for outdoor footwear because of their tensile strength, resistance to moisture, and ability to maintain tension under repeated stress. Picture a misty forest, dew dripping from pine needles, and a hiker pausing to lace their boots with a cord that resists abrasion on rocks, dirt, and roots. Nylon laces could be drawn snug without fraying, keeping the foot secure over uneven terrain while remaining flexible enough to allow small adjustments as the day wore on. Industrial advances in synthetic fibers meant these laces could be produced consistently, with even thickness and a smooth surface that threaded easily through metal or reinforced eyelets. The hiker, kneeling in the soft hum of the forest, would notice the small difference: less fraying, easier tensioning, and a durable tie that could last season after season. Laces here are no mere aesthetic, they are the quiet interface between foot, boot, and trail, silently mediating comfort, safety, and endurance in landscapes both rugged and beautiful. This shift toward synthetic materials marked a broader trend in footwear technology, where the lace becomes a technical tool as much as a functional ornament, adapting to the demands of modern outdoor life. Floating gently into the vibrant energy of urban landscapes, the 1980s CE brought a playful, visual transformation to shoelaces in the United States. Wide, fat laces emerged as a fashion statement within hip-hop culture, particularly in the streets of New York and other metropolitan centers. Unlike their hiking counterparts, these laces were exaggerated in scale and texture, designed to draw attention as much as to hold the shoe closed. Sneakers, often high tops with canvas or leather uppers, became canvases themselves, with laces as prominent visual elements crisscrossing over tongues and wrapping around ankles. The tactile quality mattered. Thick cotton braids, sometimes waxed lightly for sheen, felt substantial in hand and allowed intricate knotting and looping that could be part of personal style. Music videos, block parties, and streetwear photography circulated images of sneakers with laces that seemed almost sculptural, creating rhythm and line across the foot. These laces also served a functional role. They held high-top shoes securely during vigorous movement, dance, and sport, but the culture elevated them to accessories of identity and expression. When we imagine a slow pan across a sunlit basketball court, the laces gleam subtly, thick and strong, while simultaneously signaling individuality, rhythm, and the emerging influence of streetwear on global fashion. In this period, laces began to operate on two levels, as essential fasteners and as overt symbols of style, each knot and cross a tiny articulation of taste. Amid the quiet pre-dawn streets of the early 1980s, safety-conscious design began influencing the everyday runner and cyclist, and around 1985 CE, reflective shoelaces made their appearance in the United States. These laces incorporated reflective threads or coatings, allowing movement to catch streetlights and headlights, thereby improving visibility in low-light conditions. Imagine the quiet pre-dawn streets, soft mist drifting over pavement, and the glint of shoelaces catching a passing car's headlights, subtle yet purposeful illumination. Early designs were woven with silvered fibers, integrated into otherwise cotton or synthetic laces, and their construction balanced reflection with flexibility, durability, and not retention. Recreational runners, bicycle commuters, and pedestrians adopted these laces gradually, appreciating the way they transformed a humble accessory into a tool for safety without compromising comfort. Industrial textiles made it possible to maintain standard lace strength while embedding reflective strands, and early products were often paired with neon-colored shoes or clothing, amplifying visibility. A soft, contemplative pause allows us to notice the way light interacts with the tiny metallic fibers, flickering with each step, a quiet assurance that each knot and crossing of thread contributes to the walker's or runner's security. Reflective shoelaces exemplify the merging of function, technology, and daily life, a small but meaningful innovation where safety and habit meet in the simple act of tying one's shoes. In the gentle unfolding of the 1990s, convenience and rapid lifestyle demands shaped new shoelace experiments, and around 1990, elastic no-tie laces appeared globally, marketed under names like lock laces and bungee systems. These laces replaced traditional cotton or nylon cords with stretchy, resilient elastics threaded through standard eyelets, allowing shoes to be slipped on and off without repeated knotting. Picture a slow-motion day in the park. A child or adult slips a foot into a sneaker, the elastic giving gently, the foot settling snugly without fuss. The innovation relied on small cord lock mechanisms or tightly braided elastic, offering adjustable tension while eliminating the repetitive work of tying. These laces suited athletes, commuters, and anyone seeking convenience, transforming the ritual of fastening shoes into a quiet, continuous motion of stepping in, pulling up, and walking. The elasticity also absorbed small shocks and reduced pressure points across the instep, while the braided textures prevented slippage through eyelets. In a soft, almost meditative consideration, we see the lace's role evolving further, from mere security to ease, speed, and ergonomics, preserving function while removing effort. The introduction of no-tie laces signals a shift in footwear culture. The lace becomes flexible, forgiving, and integrated with motion, offering a small liberation while still performing its age-old duty of anchoring foot to shoe. Softly drifting into the playful early 2000s, novelty-driven innovations appeared in shoelaces, and by 2000 CE glow-in-the-dark laces emerged in the United States, and primarily at children and teenagers. These laces were infused with phosphorescent materials, either as coatings or blended threads, so that after exposure to light they emitted a soft glow in darkness. Imagine a quiet evening street or a dim bedroom, sneakers softly illuminate, the laces tracing glowing lines over canvas or leather, and the wearer experiences a small, magical sense of movement. The laces were generally cotton or synthetic braids, treated to hold knots securely while carrying luminescent pigments. Beyond mere novelty, glow-in-the-dark laces offered a form of low-level visibility, but their primary role was playful and expressive. Manufacturers found a small but consistent market for these accessories, selling them alongside sports shoes or fashion sneakers with matching neon trims. The luminous effect required repeated charging under daylight or indoor light, and the texture and flexibility of the lace needed to be preserved despite coatings. In the slow rhythm of childhood mornings or evening strolls, the glow of a lace is a quiet companion, a tiny, luminous promise that the shoe will perform, that the step is secure, and that aesthetic delight can coexist with function. Wandering into the mid-2000s, custom-printed shoelaces began to proliferate in the United States as companies and individuals recognized the branding potential of a cord that crossed the shoe and rested prominently on top of the foot. Logos, slogans, and graphic designs could be printed or woven directly onto cotton or polyester laces, transforming a utilitarian fastening into a marketing medium or fashion statement. The process required careful printing techniques so that dyes or inks would adhere without weakening the braid, while manufacturers balanced color fastness, abrasion resistance, and flexibility. Fans of sports teams, musicians, or corporate branding adopted these laces, sometimes swapping them into existing shoes for a personal or promotional touch. In this quiet industrial evolution, the lace moves again from mere fastener to communicator. A logo or slogan travels with every step, visible yet unobtrusive, interacting with movement, light, and texture. The lace remains a functional bridge between foot and shoe, but now it also carries cultural, commercial, and aesthetic information, an overlay of identity that persists with every tie and knot. A gentle pause allows us to consider that a small cord can simultaneously stabilize the foot, decorate the shoe, and broadcast a message, illustrating how even the simplest object can acquire layered purposes over time. Amid the measured rhythms of outdoor life, by 2010 CE, survivalists and hikers had prompted another technical development: paracord shoelaces in the United States, made from the versatile parachute cord originally used in military applications. These laces could serve multiple functions beyond securing footwear. They could be unraveled into rope for emergency repairs, shelter construction, or other survival needs, while remaining durable, abrasion-resistant, and not friendly when used as a lace. The braided construction of paracord, typically nylon with an internal core of smaller strands, allowed it to maintain tension and knot security while offering extraordinary tensile strength for its diameter. Imagine a quiet morning on a forest trail. A hiker adjusts a paracord lace, appreciating the weight, resilience, and soft, pliable texture, knowing that each knot holds in place but could also be freed for practical tasks if necessary. The lace's multiple lives, functional in walking, emergency use, and repair, demonstrate a deliberate integration of utility, material science, and outdoor design. Here, the act of tying a shoe intersects with preparation for survival, and a braid of cord becomes both a fastener and a resource. In the slow, measured cadence of outdoor movement, these laces illustrate how a simple innovation can quietly extend human capability while remaining entirely familiar in function. In a quiet hum of experimentation and futurism, by 2014 CE, smart laces began to emerge in prototypes in the United States, embedding chips and rudimentary Bluetooth technology to interface with fitness trackers, mobile devices, or other electronic equipment. These laces integrated thin wiring, sensors, or microcontrollers into the braid or attached along the lace's length, aiming to monitor steps, movement, or tension, sometimes triggering adaptive shoe tightness or logging activity data. Imagine a soft, indoor light reflecting on sneakers whose laces are more than cord. They are tiny instruments, recording the wearer's motion and providing feedback, invisible yet alive with microelectronic life. Prototypes were delicate. Designers balanced flexibility, weight, and comfort with the presence of electronic components, ensuring that the lace remained soft enough to knot and resilient enough for walking. The introduction of smart laces represents a convergence of traditional shoemaking with the digital age, where a single cord continues to anchor foot to shoe while simultaneously communicating with broader technological networks. In a slow breath, one can contemplate the quiet marvel, a familiar daily motion, threading, crossing, and knotting, now augmented by invisible digital companions that subtly extend the lace's function from mechanical to informational. Drifting softly into the experimental pulse of 2016 CE, the landscape of footwear innovation welcomed the first mass-market self-lacing shoes from Nike in the United States, a quiet revolution in how laces could function. These hyper-adapt sneakers carried tiny motors and sensors embedded within the shoe, responding to foot placement and tension, and drawing the lace snug automatically. Imagine a slow morning, the wearer sliding their foot into a sneaker, and a gentle whir accompanied by a subtle tightening as if the shoe knew precisely how to embrace the foot. The mechanics relied on microelectronics and battery power discreetly integrated so the lace could maintain both form and function while remaining soft and pliable to touch. Here, the lace transcends its traditional role. It is no longer only a cord to bind fabric and foot, but an intelligent interface, mediating comfort and performance with each step. Engineers and designers had to balance responsiveness, safety, and durability, ensuring that the lace could adjust consistently without causing strain or friction on the wearer. The self-lacing system also introduced a small ritual of interaction, pressing a button, waiting for a quiet mechanical hum, and feeling the shoe adapt, creating a subtle connection between human motion and machine intelligence. In this phase, the lace becomes both familiar and futuristic, a quiet marvel in the daily act of putting on shoes, bridging age-old needs with technological possibility. In the gentle unfolding of 2018 CE, magnetic lace fasteners began to replace traditional knots in the United States, transforming the act of securing shoes into a smooth, almost floating gesture. Tiny clips and neodymium magnets were integrated into laces, allowing the wearer to draw them snug with minimal effort, the pieces snapping softly into place with a faint, satisfying click. Imagine the tactile pleasure of sliding fingers along a braided cord and hearing the delicate magnetic resonance, the lace settling without twisting or knotting, effortlessly conforming to the shoe's structure. This innovation also supported speed and accessibility. Children, older adults, or athletes could secure their footwear more quickly while maintaining tension and stability. Industrial material science ensured that magnetic strength was sufficient to hold even under active movement, yet gentle enough to release without pulling or damage. Fashion designers and athletic brands experimented with these fasteners as decorative as well as functional elements, combining practicality with subtle aesthetics. A soft pause lets us appreciate how such a small modification, a magnetic clasp replacing a traditional knot, alters the choreography of dressing, turning a familiar daily motion into a quietly engineered experience. Laces now mediate not only fit but also convenience, comfort, and tactile delight, as though the shoe has learned to greet its wearer with an intelligent embrace. Emerging gently in Europe by 2019 CE, biodegradable shoelaces began to take their place in the slow currents of sustainable fashion, crafted from cotton, hemp, and other eco-conscious fibers. These laces were spun and braided to maintain tensile strength while allowing eventual decomposition, offering a small but meaningful step toward reducing environmental impact in the production and disposal of footwear accessories. Picture a soft, windswept garden or a moss-dappled forest floor. The threads of these laces, once discarded, would return to the earth quietly, leaving no trace but nourishing soil. Artisans and manufacturers carefully treated the fibers to resist fraying and wear while avoiding chemical finishes that would prevent biodegradation. Users could still tie, knot, and adjust these laces as they always had, maintaining aesthetic and functional qualities while aligning with principles of environmental stewardship. Subtle variations in color and texture allowed designers to incorporate sustainability without sacrificing visual appeal, creating a bridge between ecological consciousness and fashion. These laces whisper a quiet story of responsibility and care, illustrating how even a small cord can reflect larger values, marrying tradition with innovation, and offering a tactile reminder that the objects we touch daily can carry deeper intentions. In the quiet, urgent wake of 2020 CE, a global pandemic reshaped not only daily routines but the use of everyday objects, and shoelaces found a surprising secondary life in DIY face masks. As COVID-19 swept across continents, fabric and elastic shortages inspired inventive crafters to repurpose shoelace cords to secure homemade masks, threading them around ears or tying behind the head. Envision a softly lit kitchen table, the scent of fabric and starch in the air, hands weaving laces into loops that would hold protective layers close to the face. The tensile strength and flexibility of cotton and synthetic laces made them ideal for this unintended role, providing adjustable comfort and resilience. Communities shared patterns and tutorials, demonstrating how a small, familiar object could be adapted to urgent public health needs, quietly uniting function, resourcefulness, and care. The act of repurposing a shoelace in this context transforms the mundane into a gesture of protection, highlighting the adaptability of everyday materials and the ingenuity of ordinary hands. In these moments, a simple cord connects not only foot to shoe, but person to safety, community, and resilience, embodying both practicality and subtle creativity in a global crisis. By 2021 CE, 3D printed shoelaces emerged in the United States, marrying additive manufacturing with the familiar braided forms of traditional footwear cords. Designers experimented with polymers and flexible materials, producing custom shapes, textures, and even lattice structures that could be tuned for stretch, grip, and visual interest. Picture a quiet studio, soft sunlight filtering through a window, as a printer slowly deposits layers of filament, transforming digital patterns into tangible, functional laces. Users could personalize length, width, and design intricacies, bridging technological precision with tactile experience. 3D printing also allowed integration of multi-material features, such as reinforced eyelet tips or embedded decorative textures, while maintaining the softness and flexibility required for knotting and threading. This innovation quietly expanded the possibilities of shoelace design, aesthetics, ergonomics, and customization intertwined, offering a personal touch previously unattainable in mass production. A reflective pause highlights the transformation from passive accessory to active design medium, illustrating how a small, humble cord can carry layers of creativity, utility, and individuality. Each 3D printed lace becomes a subtle testament to technological craft, combining digital imagination with the slow, deliberate motions of tying shoes. In the soft dawn of 2022 CE, shoelaces with antimicrobial coatings began circulating in Asia, treated to resist bacteria and odor while maintaining pliability and tensile integrity. These laces incorporated silver ions or other safe biocides within synthetic fibers, providing a quiet layer of hygiene without altering appearance or texture. Imagine a dimly lit room, the subtle sheen of laces over polished sneakers, each step supported by a cord that quietly mitigates microbial growth. Designers balanced effectiveness with softness, ensuring that knotting, threading, and wearing remained as familiar and comfortable as ever. This subtle intervention addressed concerns in athletic, casual, and work footwear, where extended wear could encourage odor or contamination. The coatings did not interfere with aesthetics, allowing laces to maintain color, shine, and flexibility, preserving both form and function. A contemplative pause brings awareness to how a simple thread can carry invisible benefits, integrating science into daily rituals in unobtrusive ways. Laces here act as quiet guardians of hygiene, bridging the tactile and the microscopic, while remaining anchored in their traditional role of securing foot to shoe. Emerging gently in 2023 CE across Europe, shoelaces crafted from recycled ocean plastics began appearing as eco-conscious alternatives, transforming marine waste into functional fashion. Fibers collected from discarded bottles and nets were processed, spun, and braided into cords that retain strength, flexibility, and durability comparable to conventional synthetic laces. Picture a soft coastal morning, waves whispering against driftwood, the threads of reclaimed plastic reborn as a lace tying a shoe with purpose and care. Each step carried an echo of environmental stewardship, a tactile connection between human movement and planetary awareness. These laces were often dyed with low-impact pigments and finished to prevent fraying, combining aesthetics with ecological responsibility. In quiet reflection, one notices that the act of tying a recycled lace carries symbolism and practicality simultaneously, turning a small, everyday motion into a reminder of stewardship and innovation. Function, visual appeal, and sustainability intertwined in a single cord, illustrating how the simplest objects can be transformed to align with values while performing their age-old duties. In the softly accelerating world of 2024 CE, smart tightening laces with app connectivity began appearing in the United States, enabling users to adjust tension electronically from a smartphone. These laces, threaded through sensors and micromotors, allowed a subtle and precise pull with a gentle tap or swipe, adapting snugness in real time. Imagine a quiet living room, sneakers resting on soft carpet, a finger flicking a screen, and the lace drawing itself snug, humming faintly as it settles. Engineers balanced flexibility, comfort, and safety, ensuring the lace could adjust without constricting or damaging the foot. Integration with apps enabled tracking of tension history, tying patterns, or preferences, bridging tactile motion with digital interface. Each step became a quiet experiment in precision and comfort, extending the lace's centuries-long evolution into a realm of intelligent adaptability. In this context, tying a shoe is no longer only manual, it becomes interactive, a merging of traditional function with the gentle pulse of modern technology, where cords quietly learn and respond to the wearer. Emerging like a whisper of the natural world in 2025 CE, fully compostable plant-based shoelaces began to enter global markets, crafted from fibers designed to return to earth without residue. These laces combined strength, flexibility, and texture reminiscent of conventional cotton or hemp while ensuring that decomposition could occur in home or industrial composting conditions. Picture a soft garden morning, hands threading laces through eyelets, knowing that in months or years, the cord could dissolve quietly into soil, nourishing plants. Manufacturers carefully treated the fibers to resist fraying and maintain knot security while avoiding chemicals that would hinder composting. Users could continue tying, adjusting, and styling their footwear as always, while embracing an entirely circular life cycle for a humble, everyday object. A reflective pause reminds us that even the smallest accessory, a thin braid of plant-based fiber, can bridge centuries of functional tradition with forward-looking sustainability, merging care for the environment with tactile ritual and aesthetic experience. Gentle sigh seems to pass from one idea to the next, as the story of shoelaces slowly folds into quiet closure. The plant-based laces, returning to the earth, leave behind the softest echo of human care, and in that same tender rhythm, our journey with these simple cords begins to settle. As the fingers loosen their grip on threads once braided and threaded, the mind may start to drift, carrying the subtle hum of innovation, sustainability, and tactile habit into a soft, unmeasured pause. The narrative folds gently upon itself, letting the last whisper of functional design mingle with the quiet of the present moment, as if the laces themselves have settled into the soil, and the world exhales alongside them. If your eyes are closed, if your thoughts are drifting, then my job here is done for today. Thank you for spending this unremarkable moment with me. You have listened to The Sleepy Sloth, where uninteresting things become the softest lullabies.